Welcome to the lecture on Intrusion Prevention Systems or IPS. So let's begin with a simple example. So what if your home security system not only detected a break-in but also locked the doors automatically and called the police before the intruder could get in? That's essentially what an intrusion prevention system or IPS does for your network. So an IPS is a security device or software that's placed directly in the path of your network traffic. And this is what we call as being placed inline. And because of this placement, it's not just passively watching, it's also actively intercepting traffic and making decisions in real time. So just like an IDS helped detect exploits against the operating systems, applications, SQL injections, detects filtration, similarly, IPS also detects the same type of threats. But the response to these threats are very different in IDS versus IPS. So the primary difference between an IDS and IPS is that IPS has the capability of blocking malicious activity. It doesn't just say, hey, there's something wrong. It actually drops the packets, resets the connections, or blocks the IP. And that's why IPS is used in environments where an immediate response is critical, such as financial systems, healthcare, or any infrastructure that cannot afford downtime or data breaches. So essentially, IPS is equal to IDS plus action. Another important point which you need to understand is that an IPS needs to be placed inline so that it can actually intercept and block traffic if the need arises. Let me discuss this in more detail. So previously when we discussed network intrusion detection systems, so it was placed something like this. So here you had the network intrusion detection system. And what happened was the traffic which was going this way, a copy of it was also sent to network intrusion detection system, which then performed forensic analysis and all kinds of stuff to detect if something was wrong. However, the actual traffic still continued onto the internal corporate network. So its job was just to alert. However, in contrast, an IPS is placed inline so that it can detect and block intrusions. So in the case of IPS, the traffic actually has to pass through this IPS. And based on whether it wants to allow the traffic to go ahead or not, it can actually drop packets, block IPs, and do a bunch of stuff. So that's the primary difference. The placement is very different. For network intrusion detection systems, they just get a copy of the packet of the traffic. However, for intrusion prevention systems, the packet actually has to cross it. Now, what are the different use cases? So for network intrusion detection systems, it is ideal when you want monitoring and alerts, but you prefer a human or another system to actually take some action. So for example, let's say the IDS generated an alert of a possible attack, a cyber attack, and it generates an alert. Then you may have a SOC team, a dedicated SOC team, who have access to a wide range of tools, for example. They can go ahead, do some investigations, verify whether it's a false positive or not, and then maybe if it's an actual attack or actual malicious traffic, they can block IPs and do a bunch of stuff. However, in the case of IPS, you're delegating this responsibility to the system itself. So the use case for IPS is when you need an automated shield, which actively protects your network without waiting for manual interaction. So in the case of IPS, malicious traffic would be blocked right here. It won't be able to reach the internal networks, and IPS doesn't get a copy of the traffic, it actually sees the real traffic. Now let's compare intrusion detection systems versus intrusion prevention systems. So for the core function, an IDS detects threats and alerts. However, an IPS not only detects threats, but it also blocks them in real time. In terms of traffic placement, IDS is placed out of band, which basically means it gets a copy of the traffic. However, an IPS is always placed inline. It sits in the path of the actual traffic. In terms of action taken, IDS sends alerts only. However, in case of IPS, it blocks, drops packets, reset connections, and it can even block IPs. So what's the impact on the actual traffic? In this case, there is no interference or delay because this one it's just getting a copy of the traffic. So the actual packet can still go ahead. However, in this case, since there is some additional processing because every packet has to be processed by IPS before it's forwarded, it may introduce slight latency. Now we come to an important difference, which is the risk with false positives. Now with ITS, it basically just generates an alert. And then maybe a security specialist in a SOC team is going to have a more detailed investigation, look into it, if it's a false positive or is it an actual malicious traffic or attack, and then they can take appropriate action. So it is less disruptive. However, in the case of IPS, sometimes it can even block legitimate traffic as well. Because sometimes even legitimate traffic can sort of resemble the signature of a malicious attempt. And in that case, it may actually block legitimate traffic. So if you remember, we discussed that in the case of IPS, we define the baseline or normal behavior, and anything which deviates from that is considered an anomalous behavior and action is taken. So just to give you an example of when IPS can become an issue, let's say you're using a real-time application like Zoom or VoIP, which uses dynamic ports and high packet rates. So an IPS may flag the high traffic volume as a denial of service attack and start dropping the sessions. Another example is of large file transfers via FTP or HTTP. So a user uploads a large file to a secure company server. However, the IPS flags the upload as suspicious exfiltration and terminates the connection. So false positive are a big issue with intrusion prevention systems. To reduce such incidents, organizations, what they often do is that they fine-tune the IPS rules to be more and more precise and exact. They also use exception lists or white lists. So for example, they may add a secure file transfer server as a part of a whitelist, and any user within the organization uploading content to it would still be whitelisted. So just something to keep in mind, while IPS does provide some benefits, there are some challenges as well. So the best use case for IDS is for monitoring and forensic analysis. The best use case for IPS is real-time protection and automated prevention. However, with the caveat that you have to be very precise with your rules and exceptions and whitelists so that you don't get a lot of false positives.